Hey, Groton Bible Chapel, Zach, Associate Pastor here again with Simon from Northeast Christian Apologetics. Today, continuing to talk about some interesting and tough questions that people wrestle with.
Yep.
And today that topic is faith and science. Right off the get-go, this is one thing that for a lot of people there's what I'm going to call a perceived conflict.
Yeah.
And so can you talk a little bit just about where some of that perceived conflict lies?
Well, some of the perceived conflict lies in how we understand what faith is and what science is. So let's talk about what faith is.
Yeah.
And in the New Testament, the Greek word for faith is pistis. When people think about faith, they think about Hebrews 11. Where it says that faith is a substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And people will focus in on the fact that it's talking about evidence of things not seen. And they're confused about that. So a lot of people will think that all faith is blind. And that's not the case. Not all faith is blind. There's a lot of faith that is manifested through evidences. So what is faith? Faith is often corresponded with trust. They're also tied together. Faith or pistis in the Greek is more of an active trust. It's a trust that you actually proceed forth and your behavior follows that kind of trust or that kind of knowledge. Like these chairs that we're sitting in, and this is a classic example of faith. We are sitting in these chairs with the faith that they will hold us up. And even through our investigation, if we are to take these chairs and investigate them and say, oh, okay, the structural integrity is good, it looks like it's a good design, the wood is solid, I now trust these chairs to hold my weight. You're still placing faith not only in the chair, but also your investigation. That your investigation was adequate. And sometimes, I've definitely been in the situation where I've learned that my investigation wasn't actually adequate, and that the thing that I put my trust in wasn't worthy of that trust.
I think another kind of cross example in Scripture is in James. It refers to even the demons believe, referring to they know what is true about God, but they wouldn't trust themselves to Jesus as their Lord and Savior. They know who God is, they know where the chair is, but they don't sit in the chair. And so people reduce faith sometimes to, you mentioned blind, but also they reduce it to just merely agreeing that something is true, where that word trust, active trust, as you mentioned it, captures the idea of there's a little bit more to it than that.
Yeah, there's definitely more to it. And when the chapter 11 of Hebrews goes into the Hall of Fame of faith, Abraham, when he offered up Isaac, as they mentioned in chapter 11 of Hebrews, that's not the first thing that God asked him to do. God had already revealed himself to him at Sodom and Gomorrah, and also for proving that his promise was true.
Well, he told him to get up and leave.
Yeah,
right?
He told him to get up and leave.
Got to go to a new land.
The new land. You get up out of the land of the Chaldeans and just trust me. And so Abraham had already been working up this trust, and it was brought forth through evidence. Some of it was small at first, like getting up and leaving, even though that is a big move to leave your family behind. But it's not quite as big as sacrificing your own son. You know what I mean? So Abraham wasn't working on a strict blind faith. God, he had a lot of evidence to finally come to the point and trust God that even if I do sacrifice my son Isaac, God is going to raise him from the dead.
Yeah.
Because God already promised that my lineage is going to be going through Isaac. So he had this kind of faith and trust in God, and it was perfectly justified because of the history that God and Abraham had, and the evidence, and he acquired this faith.
And God comes back to his own actions time and time again. I am the God that delivered you out of Egypt. And even as you fast forward to the resurrection itself, the apostles, what in the heck's going on? Jesus died, mobilized by his resurrection. They had his new body standing before them as their evidence of what God had done. And then And then moving forward, Peter, who had gone from denying him 3 times to now being told, feed my sheep.
Yep, very true. Very true. So that's where we sit as Christians with faith. When we talk about faith, it's not merely some kind of blind faith. In some situations, you do have to exercise some kind of blind faith. But it's not just with Christianity. It's with life in general.
Yeah.
You know, people will probably scoff at this, but getting behind the wheel of your car is a lot of times blind faith. You don't know what's going to happen down the road. You know, you don't know. I just had somebody cut me off just today coming to here. So you never know when death is going to meet you or some sort of catastrophe. And we place faith in like our vehicles, or we place our faith in our schedule, or even our own skill and knowledge of how to respond to things. So faith is something that is integral to human life. It's something that we cannot separate ourselves from. Faith is something that every human has for everything in their life.
Everyone on some level has to make assumptions in this life, often regarding things they cannot prove.
Yep.
In order to just operate. And you might call that faith. Some people might call that faith. And one, in philosophy, one really common one has to do with the problem of induction. And so, how do I know that my eye works? I use my eye to prove that my eye works. Wait a second, that's a circular argument.
Yeah.
How do you prove that? You have to assume that your eye works in order to prove that your eye works.
Yep.
And that assumption is something you cannot prove, and philosophers have wrestled with this for hundreds of years, going back to Hume. And so you start with a faith presupposition and you build on that. And so people, Christian or not, they do a lot of things throughout their day, operating without even really realizing it off of assumptions they cannot prove. And we'll call those some of those acts of faith, if you will.
I 100% agree with that. As a matter of fact, I was going to talk about that when we talked about the science aspect. You know?
Okay.
Yeah.
There it is. Okay.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about science now. People here at Ground Bible Chapel don't know me or anything, but I've done science professionally for about 15 years, and it was in the form of nuclear chemistry. So I'm pretty familiar with the scientific method, and was successful at it in that career.
Which is good, because we have a lot of scientists here.
That's
between
awesome.
Between EB and Pfizer and Millstone, like there's a lot of people here.
Yeah,
so,
I was at Millstone.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty comfortable with the scientific method. But what is science? Yeah. You know, even at Millstone and these places, some people are kind of hesitant to call themselves like scientists or play with the idea that they're very familiar with science. But basically what science is like a methodology of how to go about obtaining data and then using that data to generate hypotheses and then getting more data to test those hypotheses. So that's all that science is. It's data acquisition and falsifying hypotheses. And when we operate with science, we have some assumptions that you already kind of alluded to, but science is riddled with assumptions, things that science itself can't prove, but it assumes to be true in order for it to even work.
Can I tell you one of my favorites?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so when I was, I listened to a PhD in astrophysics from University of Colorado talk about this a few years back, about that we cannot prove the one-way speed of light. And no one has ever been able to prove that. They've only ever been able to test it 2 ways. And so I actually reached out to a friend who's doing his grad work at a University of Oklahoma in physics just last year, because I was thinking about using this in a sermon. And I asked him, is this true? And he's like, yep, we still don't, we have to assume the speed of light because there's no way to prove the one-way speed of light. That's in kind of a practical expression, but it gets even more basic than that.
It does get even more basic than that. You already alluded to one, like science has to assume that the external world is actually true, and that was part of what you were saying. You know, like science has to assume that, you know, like I'm not the only thing that exists, and that I actually do have a body, that the external world is true, that there are another assumption is that other minds actually exist, like you're not some sort of I'm not hallucinating you, you're a real person, you're not like some kind of zombie.
A lot of that boils down to the reliability of your senses.
That's the next one that I was going to say. Science has to assume that your senses are generally reliable, that they inform you accurately about the external world. And not only that, but that our language is adequate for explaining the external world. That's an assumption that science has to make. Another one is the assumption that our mathematics can actually accurately describe the external world. There are a lot of things, people will often say that science is like the only way that you can come to any kind of sure knowledge of things, but those are the things that science cannot prove is true. They're just constantly confirmed.
I want to park there for a moment. You just said something. You said people will say that science is the only way to truly determine something's true. Now, I want to make this distinction because this is important. There is a difference between science and scientism, right? And so scientism says science is the only way to know something's true. And what's interesting is that you cannot scientifically prove that statement.
Yep.
It is impossible by science to prove that science is the only way to prove something's true.
Yep.
And so it is self-invalidating, if you will. And it is a philosophical statement. It is not a scientific statement. And because we would say the scientific method is a method.
Right, it is a method
of determining something that's true. Now, I want your comments on something, because something you'll often hear in these conversations is someone will say, the science says.
Yeah.
And science doesn't speak.
Right.
There is not this person named science that knows everything that people are quoting.
Yeah.
And so what do people mean when they say that, and why is that kind of a misnomer?
Well, they will take data, and then they will interpret the data, and then they will say that this interpretation is the true way to interpret the data. And that's when they say that science says, that the science says this.
What they mean is a group of interpreters
are
making that conclusion.
The thing about science, and this is the really interesting thing about science to me, is that, like I said earlier, science is just data acquisition and then generating hypotheses.
Yeah.
But how you generate hypotheses is dependent on your philosophy. So science is actually dependent on philosophy in order for it to actually work and actually function. And how good your science is depends on how good your philosophy is. Yeah. One other interesting thing is that philosophy is dependent on your theology. So your philosophy is only as good as your theology. So the hierarchy, the natural hierarchy of it, and obviously non-Christians will disagree with us, but it's theology, philosophy, and then science. Science supports philosophy, and philosophy supports theology, but theology reigns supreme.
Historically, theology was called the queen of the sciences.
It was, yes, it was.
Yeah, that word scientia in Latin referring to knowledge. But back to your original point, which is that science assumes a philosophy. And what you mean by that is there are assumptions about the world that we make in order to make sense of the world.
Yeah.
And that is philosophy. And those assumptions are built on what we do or do not think about God.
Yeah.
And oftentimes would you say that the assumptions people make actually conflict with their theology? And so one word that gets thrown around in all this discussion is naturalism, right? You hear things like naturalistic evolution. Yeah. You know, when people talk about naturalism, what is it that they're talking about in science?
When they're talking about naturalism, they're talking about this philosophical worldview in which the natural world is all there is. That when we talk about the natural world, we're talking about like space, time, matter, and energy, and that there is no supernatural element to this reality that we're living in. So
everything in existence within that particular worldview operates based on the laws of nature and the rules of physics.
Exactly, just the laws of nature and physics, and that energy exists, and and we find it in different forms, whether it be solid matter like you and me, or light waves, or any other kind of gravitational waves, stuff like that. So
now, not all scientists are naturalists.
Correct. Yeah, not all scientists are naturalists. But when you go about doing science, Christian scientists will take on what's called a methodological naturalism, and what that is that you just treat the world as if it is just natural. That naturalism is true only as a methodology in order to generate hypotheses for how the world actually works, if God doesn't intervene.
Can we talk a little bit about some of our complaints with naturalism?
Sure.
I personally find it wanting in a lot of areas.
Yeah.
And I do think that people, without realizing it, people particularly agnostic or atheists, have a naturalistic, they would say they're naturalists, but they don't actually take that to its ultimate conclusions about the world. And so if we're naturalists, for instance, everything that we do, that we say, that we think is on some level just the result of the laws of physics playing out in our brain.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, and what the consequences of that is that there's no free will and that there's no such thing as love.
Or good, or evil.
Or good or evil. Some will say that.
Sam Harris, he's a famous atheist writer. He refers to us as biochemical puppets.
He's not the only one.
He's not the only one.
Richard Dawkins will say that too.
And Richard Dawkins, in one of his writings, said, what we see in this world is reminiscent of no good and no evil, that just blind, pitiless indifference, in quotes. That's how he would refer to the world. But as we think about the way humans interact, that's not how people act.
No, it's not. I personally also have problems with naturalism in a different way. And my problem with naturalism is that it's too limited of a description of reality. It's too narrow-minded. We as Christians, we have a much broader view of reality, and the way that we go about it differently as Christians from atheists is because a lot of non-Christians, or a lot of atheists in particular, think that they can only believe that which they have justification to believe, and so they believe that they haven't had any experience of the divinity of God or Jesus in their lives, and they think that they've only interacted with matter and matter and energy and science and space-time and stuff like that, and so they think that they can only be justified in believing that. But that is to put too much of an emphasis on your own very finite, very limited experience. Like we already know that there is more to this reality, even if it was just naturalism, than what we have experienced. There's more to the universe than what we have uncovered and what we have discovered. Or else, if we thought that we have discovered everything, why would we continue looking? Obviously, there's more to learn. So if we already know that there's more out there, and it's not that we just believe that there's more to discover, we know that there's more to discover because we know for a fact that we're not omniscient. The human race, even collectively, does not have all the knowledge that there is out there. So why would we be justified in saying that naturalism is true? Why would we limit the scope of reality to just the natural? We have no justification for that, even if our experience, which it isn't, but even if our experience is completely explained by the processes of space-time, matter, and energy, that even doesn't give us justification to say there is no supernatural, there is no God. That is completely unfounded.
Another byproduct of naturalism is that universal abstract concepts like justice, you mentioned love, you can put morality in there, dignity, that those get reduced down to chemical reactions in the brain or things that we impose on others or get imposed upon us, but they are not real in any sense because they are not material things. I can't touch a justice. I can't touch a dignity.
Same thing with numbers. Same thing with propositions.
Absolutely.
Those kind of stuff.
Vern Poythress out of Westminster has done some great stuff. He did his PhD in math and then in theology on redeeming logic, redeeming math, things like that, if people are interested.
Who was that again?
Vern Poythress. Yeah. But to go back to the science and faith thing that we've mentioned in the past, science can only tell you what is. One of the shortcomings of science that people don't realize is that it can't tell you what ought to be.
Yep.
And I've had that problem with people. And I had a conversation with someone a couple years ago, and we were disagreeing over, how something should look in the world. And they said, well, I just follow the science. And I had them explain to me where they got, because at some point they made a jump from science to philosophy, or to theology, because those are the two realms in which the ought enters in. Science can only tell you what is.
Right.
And I just feel like people don't realize the disconnect there.
Yeah, you're completely right on that. And I'm not even, to be honest, once they get to that point, it's hard for me to try to get them to understand that for some reason. I haven't been able to, even people at Millstone, like our culture is, you get engrossed in math and these abstract objects from a young age, but then we incorporate sciences and we're always applying the math to the physical world, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly fine. But a lot of them get confused and think that these abstract objects, like mathematics and justice and stuff like that, that they don't exist at all,
Yeah.
And which is kind of strange.
So one more thing on the naturalism that pops in, and I mentioned earlier the idea of morality. And so if, like we've mentioned in the past, everything you do or say is merely the result of the law of physics playing out in your brain, what right do I have to be upset at physics? I drop a bottle from my hand and it lands on the ground. I don't get mad at gravity. That's just physics. And so if somebody voted for a particular politician, if someone did a horrendous crime, that's merely physics. That's merely the laws of nature. If naturalism is true, if free will is an illusion or a myth, what justification is there to be morally outraged? But people don't act that way.
Right. Yeah.
People don't act like naturalism is true. They might say it, but they actually tend to act a little bit more like the Bible is true.
And they also tend to believe that they have the capacity to reason. If naturalism is true, then you aren't able to reason towards truth. Mm-hmm. We're only able to behave in accordance with, the chemical reactions and electrical impulses of the brain. And that there is no telling what way your reasoning would behave. And why would it go towards truth? Why not preferably towards survival? Because if evolution is true, then we are animals that are geared towards survival. So our reasoning is towards survival, not towards truth. So how can we be sure that our ability to take in our data through our senses and to reason towards truth? Maybe we're constantly just reasoning towards survival instead of truth.
So I'm really glad you brought that up. So Alvin Plantinga, who I know you're familiar with, has actually put in some of one of his books where the conflict really lies. He actually presents examples about how believing lies could get you to survive just as well as believing truth.
Yeah.
And if naturalism is true, the brain didn't evolve to be certain about truth. And so your biggest authority for truth, if that's your worldview, can't actually validate its own certainty. But again, people don't live that way. Yeah. People live as if they were created by a personal, all-powerful God, and they make decisions about the world assuming something about their brain that makes sense with a biblical worldview.
Right. It's almost as though we're designed to be creatures that are interested in the pursuit of truth.
Yes.
Which is another reason why I like to say to people, especially atheists, is like, if you like science, then as a Christian, I like to say, you're welcome. Because...
let's go there. Let's talk about some of the origins of this stuff.
Yeah, science is actually... The modern scientific method is actually born out of Christianity. And why is that? Why is Christianity, or why are the fathers of science Christians? Like we're talking about Isaac Newton, we're talking about Galileo, we're talking about Copernicus, Kepler, like Bohr. The list goes on and on. These are all people who are born with a Christian worldview. Well, it's because science, as we discussed earlier, has certain assumptions. And one of those assumptions is the belief that the universe is orderly. If atheism is true, then there's no reason why we should expect the universe to behave consistently from moment to moment. Why expect that how the universe is behaving now would persist to the next moment. Yes, we have a ton of evidence from our past, provided that our past is real. But why that doesn't give us any truth or a rock solid justification for believing that the next moment will behave like the previous moment. But in the Christian worldview, it's more natural to believe that it is because we have a reliable, trustworthy God in control of the universe. So we can expect that when an object behaves a certain way in this universe, that it'll keep behaving that way because God had ordained it to do that.
Isn't it true that one of the biggest kind of boat shakers in that regard was On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin? That took on the naturalistic worldview. It removed God from the equation, and it really did just make things about this is how nature is. And we're going to assume all those things, the uniformity of nature, all those things. We're just going to assume those because we can. We don't need a reason for them.
Yeah. They don't even appreciate it. They don't really even recognize it as an assumption that needs some sort of
justification.
Justification or explanation, So.
Now to go back to some of those old guys for a moment, I just also want to point out, Galileo, that some of the conflict that he had with other people, including in the church, was scientific conflict. That he was making statements about the world, in particular, the way that the rotation of the earth affects the sloshing of the oceans and the tides and the waves. He was confronted by people who pointed out that's not true. Like your scientific statement is a false statement. The Catholic Church funded Jesuits in particular doing astronomy and lots of scientific research. And so there were scientific interactions within the church. It wasn't this cold group of religious people saying, anything you're trying to do to explore creation is anti-Bible. That's far too reductionistic.
Yep, for sure.
And so kind of bringing this full circle, thinking about today.
Yeah.
The conflict, the perceived conflict between faith and between science. You define science as, that which we can observe in order to gather data, in order to repeatedly test a hypothesis. And then faith being kind of the active trust that we put in God. People bring that to the Bible, and that's probably a loci of difficulty for some people, because they would say, the Bible can't be true and science be true. Science disproves the Bible.
They say that a lot. Yeah.
Is a statement. So when someone brings that to the table, what would you say to that person?
Well, we really need to understand why or she says that, because a lot of them will refer to the Genesis account of creation in order to say that the science disproves the Bible. And that becomes a very tricky kind of thing.
Yes. Yes, it does.
So we also have to, and this is a long conversation that we're not going to be able to hash out here, but a lot of the conflict with regard to the Bible and science is a misunderstanding of what the intention of the Bible is. The Bible is not intended to be a scientific textbook. It is not. What the purpose of the Bible is to explain who the main character of reality is. And the main character of reality is God. Yeah. And it explains our relationship to this ultimate reality.
And so, for instance, you mentioned Genesis, the first couple of chapters of Genesis. When Moses, people forget that was written, for instance, not in a vacuum. It was written to a particular people, addressing a particular set of circumstances. And so, do I think that discussing the age of the earth can be an important and good conversation? Yeah. Do I think discussing the days of creation can be a fruitful conversation? Absolutely. Do I think that the people that had just come out of Egypt were going to Moses and saying, can you please ask God how old the earth is? We've been wondering this for... No.
Yeah.
No, not at all. Genesis 1 and 2, in a extremely aggressive way, confronts ideologies about creation in the world that the people had received in Egypt. And so if you don't know what those are, if you don't know what's being confronted, it's really hard to make sense of those first two chapters. And so we can't read it in a vacuum. I'm not saying that those conversations aren't important, but the main focus of those chapters is reconstituting and reorienting the people away from what they got in Egypt to focusing in on the one true God.
Yep, absolutely. One thing that I feel like I should mention is that today a lot of people will say that the 7 days is unfeasible because it's too short and that the age of the universe is too long. The time frame in which the universe was created in the Genesis account has always been something of a controversial topic in Christianity. It's not necessary to interpret it one particular way as a Christian. For example, St. Augustine had trouble with the 7-day account because it was too long. For Augustine, he was like, God has the power to create all of this instantly.
This is the most influential Christian outside of the apostles, right? In all of human history. And he has the opposite concern that a lot of people today have.
Yeah, he has the opposite concern. He's like, so he's like, why would God do it in 7 days? Why didn't he do it instantly?
Yeah.
And so this kind of question is perfectly legitimate to be asking and exploring and discussing together. And we should be endeavoring to love one another through these less important kind of parts of Christianity.
And again, I would encourage you, if you're someone who has a diehard stance on those first 2 chapters, but you haven't actually explored the context to the people in their backdrop to which it was written, that's important.
Yeah.
Like you're missing a giant chunk of what's being communicated, because as we would say, Jesus is king, but context is queen. And so again, those
I've never heard that, but that's great.
I know, as someone likes to say around here. And so if you great conversations, and we're in a non-denominational environment in which
you're going to be meeting up with lots of people with different opinions.
We have people with different views, and we want to navigate those in a God-glorifying way.
Yeah.
But again, context is important.
Context is extremely important.
Yeah.
And there's a variety of different kinds of contexts, too. So keep that in mind.
Yeah. So, hey, thank you for taking a listen as we talk through science and faith and lots of other things that we get to ramble about along the way. Simon, thank you so much for being here, as always. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
Please take a look at some of the links in the description if you want to hear more about Northeast Christian Apologetics, and Simon produces other content there. Also, Reasonable Faith is another great ministry equipping people to defend the faith in apologetics.
Yep.
So,
I'm your local chapter director for Connecticut. For Reasonable Faith. So if you ever have any questions related to Dr. Craig's content, I'm very familiar with that. Reach out to me. I'll be providing my email in the description of this video, and don't hesitate to call me.
all right. Thanks, Simon. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.